Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time, all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And together we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare moment, it would mean the world to us if you drop a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Those reviews help boost us up the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on so many different social medias.
On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton.
On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry. And on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Close Talking.
We also have a whole website just for the podcast. It is closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show. And Cardboard Box Productions has a newsletter, Unboxed. So if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and on all the literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes.
All right, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome to this all-new episode of Close Talking. I'm your co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I'm your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And we are here today to talk about yet another fantastic poem. Our format is that we read the poem, we talk about the poem, we read the poem again. And today's poem is an excerpt from the Condoleezza Suite by Nikky Finney. This excerpt is Concerto No. 7, Condoleezza, Working Out, at the Watergate. Before we dive into the poem, a quick friendly reminder that our podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, as it's also, I think, more commonly known, but it's Apple Podcasts now, I guess. But because of that, something that really helps us find new listeners and also just generally makes us feel oh so very good is when we get ratings and reviews. And so if you have the time and you like what we do here, if you could hop over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review, that would be absolutely fantastic. It brings a lot of joy to our lives. Our poem today is by Nikky Finney, and Nikky Finney is just incredible. I'm about to list some really exciting accomplishments, but I have to say first, Connor and I were at AWP. Connor was representing Close Talking on a panel of literary podcasts, which was in itself a very exciting occurrence.
Woo woo.
Woo woo, indeed. But we went to a joint program with Natalie Diaz. You can find an episode we did a while back on a poem of hers, and Nikky Finney. And they were so incredible. And their readings were so powerful, and the work they're doing, I encourage you all to go look up the work that these two incredible women do, because it is so important, and they do it so well with so much thought and care, not only to the work they're doing, but the language that they use for the subjects that they work on. Both of them are doing work right now that's focused on the history of incarceration. It is just incredible to hear them talk about it. I feel so lucky that I got to be there. And I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I think we had pretty similar experiences.
It was one of the best readings that I've ever been to. Nikky Finney, if you have a chance to hear her read,
oh my God,
goddamn shit. Wow. I mean, she arrested the whole audience. I mean, it was like just wow. I mean, such command, like, whew. I mean, it was a testament because words are hard to listen to when it's just like hard to hear it, process it, understand it. That's why you have a lot of poets who speak very slowly, and it's nice. This is a very small point, but Nikky Finney read actually oftentimes quite rapidly, but with such forward propulsion and clarity and conviction, and also just the poem itself was insanely good, that everyone followed along, and it was like amazing. And this poem also is amazing, and she's amazing. I mean, she's what? This poem is from her book Head Off and Split, which came out, I think, in 2010.
Yes, and won the 2011 National Book Award for Poetry for sure.
Right. Which I am reading through right now, and it's amazing.
So Nikky Finney was born in South Carolina in the late 50s. She was the daughter of two people who were very active in the civil rights movement. And so she has been involved in social justice work basically her entire life. And a lot of what brought her to poetry and the way that she wanted to do her work is tied together. That's kind of the way that I've seen her write and talk about it. Those are two things that are like linked for her very much. She has a great quote: "I wanted to be a poet who didn't shout, who said things, but said them with the most beautiful attention to language," as a way of describing. Yeah, I thought that was so cool. And she's been very successful. She won the Pan American Open Book Award for Head Off and Split. She also won Benjamin Franklin Award for Poetry, and she holds the Provost's Distinguished Service Professorship. She is the Provost's Distinguished Service Professor of English at the University of Kentucky, and she's one of the founders of the Afro-Latin Poets, which is for African American poets from Appalachia. You can find out more about that at afrolatinpoets.org. Her acceptance speech, which you can find online, and I highly encourage you to do so. You can find her acceptance speech for accepting the 2011 National Book Award for Poetry. And John Lithgow is sort of charmingly presiding over the proceedings, and he does a little introduction, and she comes up and she just nails it. And then he sort of John Lithgow's his way back to the podium afterwards and says something to the effect of, "Other people are going to give acceptance speeches tonight, but that's the greatest acceptance speech for anything I've ever heard in my entire life," which I think pretty much just sums up the level at which Nikky Finney operates right there. So yeah, this is an excerpt from the Condoleezza Suite, Concerto No. 7, Condoleezza, Working Out at the Watergate by Nikky Finney. Condoleezza rises at 4, stepping on the treadmill. Her long fingers brace the two slim handles of accommodating steel. She steadies her sleepy legs for the long day ahead. She doesn't get very far. Her knees buckle, wanting back last night's dream. Dream number 9. She's 15 and leaning forward from the bench, playing Mozart's piano concerto in D minor, alone, before the gawking, disbelieving, applauding crowd. Not dream number 2. She's 9, and not in the church that explodes into dust. The heart pine floor giving way beneath her friend Denise, rocketing up into the air like a jack-in-the-box of a black girl wrapped in a Dixie cross. She ups the speed on the treadmill, remembering she has to be 3 times as good. Don't mix up your dreams, Condi. She runs faster, back to the right, finally hitting her stride. Mozart returns to her side. She's 15 again, all smiles and relocated to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, where she and the Steinway are the only black people in the room.
Damn.
Whoa.
That's so good.
I know we usually do a narrative rundown at the beginning, but I think this one's pretty obvious. It's about Condoleezza Rice. I guess quick background on who Condoleezza Rice is. She was, for the first term of George W. Bush's administration, the National Security Advisor, so she was in a very prominent position groundbreaking as a woman of color in that position, but also somebody who then was part of the group of people who oversaw the run up to the war in Iraq, and also presided over the war in Afghanistan, and was part of the group that was sort of selling the American people on the idea of WMDs in Iraq. And then in the second term of the Bush administration served as Secretary of State. Again, groundbreaking as a woman of color to be in that position. But again, a lot of what she was doing was working on this very conservative foreign policy agenda of the Bush administration. And in this poem, basically, she gets up very early in the morning and goes to do her morning workout and is thinking back to dreams she had the night before. One dream, and both of these dreams reference real events from Condoleezza Rice's life. One is that when she was 15, she played with she is herself a concert level trained, highly accomplished pianist. She's played with Yo-Yo Ma. You can find videos on the internet. And she played at the age of 15 with the symphony orchestra. And then also when she was 9 years old, and in 1963, when she was 9, was when the church bombings in Birmingham, Alabama happened. And she actually did have a friend, Denise, who she knew her family had previously lived in the South before moving to Colorado. And one of her friends was one of the young girls who was killed in those explosions.
I think she actually was in Birmingham when the bomb went off. I think she was in a different church. She was in her father's church, who was a pastor, which was 2 miles away from that church.
And so this is sort of, we're with her on the treadmill early in the morning thinking about all of these things, and her just sort of trying to quiet her mind almost during her morning exercise, and we're kind of in her thoughts. One thing that's really interesting in thinking about the narrative of this poem and just generally looking at this poem is that there was this article published in the New York Times called Condoleezza Rice on Piano by Anthony Tomasini, which it seems to me pretty clear this poem is based off of.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have somewhere you particularly want to start with this, but I was sort of curious. We'll make sure to post a link to this article. We both read it. We don't usually prepare in tandem ahead of time, but just because this article is so clearly referenced in the poem, I thought it'd be a good idea if we both did. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about building a poem like this off of something like basically a feature article on a public figure.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Because it's funny. Like, I mean, I think writers are all the time reading other things, even just non-artistic things, and basing itself, and being inspired by that. But the article begins with Condoleezza Rice getting up at 4 a.m. And is on the treadmill, and references like the fact that she grew up in Birmingham, and that was there when the bomb happened, and that she was is kind of also about her just virtuosity as a classical pianist, and kind of the role that had in her life, and then also discusses that she moved to Colorado, I think, at some point. At any rate, which is just Condoleezza rises at 4, stepping on the treadmill, is like the poetic compression of the first paragraph of that article in a way. And it's really interesting. One thing that's interesting about this poem, sort of for thinking about the article specifically, is it's an excerpt. It's part of I think it's called the Condoleezza Suite. It's got the musical vibe throughout. There's Concerto No. 5, Condoleezza and Intransigence is the first one, which is hilarious. Concerto No. 7, Condoleezza working out at the Watergate. That's the one we're talking about. Concerto No. 11, Condoleezza and the Chickering. Number 12, Condoleezza visits NYC. And in total in the book, it's about 7 pages long. At any rate, this might be a weird way to start, but it's funny because I used to teach when I was in my MFA a year of composition, just kind of rhetoric, how to write an essay kind of thing. And we had a kind of a lot of latitude about what syllabus we were going to use, what readings, etc. One thing that I did that I thought was interesting, at least for my own purposes pedagogically, was the thinking about how to say or how to tell the same story in different forms. So we had this project where there's a story called Shall We Dance, I think, by Raymond Carver. And there's a movie that's called Everything Must Go, which features Will Ferrell in a rare dramatic role, and it's actually quite good. But that movie is based on the story. And then there's one iconic Elizabeth Bishop poem, In the Waiting Room. And there's actually in her prose, it seems like kind of journals or diaries, there's basically a prose version of that experience. Anyway, the school project was kind of like comparing the two things, which have ostensibly the same or similar content, but are in different forms, and thinking about how, what do you get from one that you don't get from the other, or what does one highlight that the other doesn't? At any rate, so I was kind of immediately was like, oh, wow, this is like, I wish I had actually knew about this when I was teaching the class, because this would be a perfect kind of comparison. I mean, it's interesting just because the article, I can't tell if it's just because it's a news article, a news feature, and they're obliged to take the relatively neutral tone, or if it's at a time when, I don't know, the Bush administration and the actors in it were less universally, or maybe they're not universally, but in my head, reviled.
Now,
But
2006 was the year the Democrats took back the House. It was a pretty
okay,
it was a pretty dark. This was like a low point in where public opinion was starting to turn on the Iraq War. It was becoming clear that even though, mission accomplished had been declared, like IED attacks were on the rise. This was before the surge, but after mission accomplished, this was really where the political ramifications at home of the war were becoming more broadly accepted.
okay, that's helpful to know. Yeah, because the article came out in like April of 2006, I think.
Yeah, and so it was that fall that that midterm election cycle, that fall was where the Democrats took back the House. Nancy Pelosi became the speaker for the first time.
Yeah. Well, so I guess like it's interesting to me. I guess here's the kind of the thought / question that I have is the piano and the her playing the piano is kind of like the counterpoint conceit of both pieces, the poem and the article, that kind of serve to show something else about this figure who, a political, like really well-known figure, but not necessarily in a personal way. And the article, in the kind of way of a profile, has a sort of just interest in humanizing, perhaps. And the piano is this kind of way of doing so. Like there's a part in the article where she's talking about like how playing the piano isn't relaxing for her, but it's transporting for her, and you can imagine her job is a highly demanding and needs this kind of respite or whatever. For Nikky Finney, the piano is a much more charged counterpoint. And obviously the Finneys and the speakers sort of gaze on Condoleezza is much more damning, or at the very least pointed. Nowhere in the news article is there any mention of like the fact that classical music as a genre and as audience as a very, predominantly white and sort of upper class elite sort of institution and genre or whatever. Whereas for Finney, it seems like, at least as an initial thing, it sort of symbolizes Condoleezza Rice's like complicity and actions in the service of white supremacy or something. I don't know. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's like her stepping into the classical world serves a symbolic function of her stepping into this white elite space. I guess that was the kind of the first, it's like the first way I had of comparing the two is like, the piano, the classical music is that the vehicle, and like to what end is it being used?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I like what was really interesting to me about this poem is that it basically took all of the subtext in that article and made it text. And like so often poems live on their subtext or on their implied meanings and everything. And there's a lot going on in this poem still, but what it's effectively doing is it's taking all of these questions and tensions about the fact that Condoleezza Rice is a Black woman, and it's pulling them out and it's actually interrogating them. Whereas in this article, there's all of this laudatory language around her, but part of it's predicated on, wow, look at how impressive this person is. Not only is this the Secretary of State, she had become the Secretary of State a little over a year before the article went out, but like she's a concert pianist and she meets with this group and she practices these classical music pieces and is technically highly accomplished on an instrument. And in a way, that article turns all of its readers into that cheering audience from the poem. She's 15, leaning forward from the bench, playing Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, alone before the gawking, disbelieving, applauding audience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think of, because certainly it's like, especially this kind of article in the New York Times, I mean, it's like a New Yorker profile, which is like the more extreme version of like the coastal elite white audience. Like I remember reading a New Yorker profile of, was this like StarCraft like prodigy, this computer game prodigy who's like, but also it was like, she is Canadian, she is trans, and but in the the profile is very funny because they would make these references to classical music just like off the cuff and not explain them. And then there was a whole paragraph that they basically devoted to explaining what the phrase GG meant, which is like good game. Which is like what any person who played any computer or video game like ever would learn immediately. It's
People
like you
say
just
that on chess.com. That's the level that works at.
Yeah.
That's hysterical.
But
I love that you brought that up because the NPR podcast about race, Code Switch, has a really wonderful, they did a whole episode on what they call the explanatory comma and what that means about who you're writing or creating a piece for. And so depending on when you do something, say like Condoleezza Rice, comma, national security, first African-American woman to serve as national security advisor and secretary of state, and did so under the first and second terms of the Bush administration, and comma, continue with the sentence. When you deploy those explanatory commas, explains what audience you're writing for. And they interviewed people who talked about like, I listen to NPR and I feel like it's not for me because every time they mention Tupac, they put an explanatory comma after who he is, and I know who he is, so I know this isn't for me,
Yeah.
Whereas exactly what you're saying, there's like a paragraph devoted to explaining Good Game, whereas they just toss off, references to Shakespeare or classical music or Winston Churchill or whatever. I don't know, something else extremely white.
Yeah.
and like classical.
Yeah. No, the things that writing assumes or feels the need to explain sort of says a lot about who they think or who they want their audience to be. And in this, that's a very good point. And it's interesting talking about making that subtext text, and also just those dreams. I feel like are such a good thing to focus on in the text of it on the page, which you cannot hear, unfortunately. The dreams are italicized, and it goes like, her knees buckle wanting back last night's dream, sort of ends this 4 stanza, which is not italicized. Then there's the bracket, dream number 9, end bracket. And then we have the dream number 9. She's 15, leaning forward from the bench, playing the Mozart. And then it's like not bracket, dream number 2, end bracket. And then she is 9 and not in the church that explodes into dust. So I just say this because they're kind of like very specifically distinguished from the rest of the text. And it makes me, it's very also like these 2 dreams are kind of like these 2. Then, later the other italics part is don't mix up your dreams, Condi, which is hilarious and a taunt. But gets at this point that the 2 dreams sort of represent kind of 2 poles, I think, where she's from, the bombing of the church and the killing of those 4 girls in Birmingham is like one of the most iconic like moments of violence in the civil rights movement, and was so horrifying, but became such an emblem for the extent to which, white supremacists and white supremacy would go to like maintain, their Jim Crow segregation and, their racial order that they wanted or whatever. And the fact that Condoleezza Rice grew up and knew someone, who died in that violence, is like, seems to be Finney is pointing out this as like a central pole of her identity that she is trying to not think about, right? And trying to avoid by thinking about her in the snowy white peaks of the Rocky Mountains, 15 playing classical Mozart to an all-white audience. The only other Black person is a Steinway piano. Last poem in the suite, Condoleezza visits NYC, which is during hurricane season, sort of has a lot to do with Katrina. And, and there we have Bush famously, Kanye West's best moment, George Bush doesn't care about Black people. Famously, a situation where the administration of George W. Bush, so visibly neglecting Black communities in a time of great need. In the Concerto number 11, and interesting, this also the article brings up, but her name, Condoleezza, comes from Condoleezza, which means with sweetness in Italian, as a kind of musical notation, like in the same way you'd say largo as slow or something like that. And she comes from, her mom and her grandmother were both great piano players. At any rate, there's this part in that one. In the future, when she plays Secretary of State on the world stage, the black keys will always be a stretch, which I feel like is great.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Well, that's something that you started off describing how the dreams are sort of offset from the rest of the poem, and also that line, "Don't mix up your dreams, Condi," which is rendered in the same way, indicating it's maybe her talking to herself or thinking those words to herself, because the dreams, which are the interiority from her that we get, are also italicized. But when she's encountering difficulty on the treadmill, she steadies her sleepy legs for the long day ahead. She doesn't get very far. Her knees buckle, wanting back last night's dream. And the dream she wants back is playing the piano. It's this vision of personal achievement, and not this other dream about systemic violence. And we've talked a little bit about how one highlights, a whiter cultural tradition, and one is very much about violence done against Black people, and one of the most horrific iterations of white supremacy. And what she does in response to thinking about the dream she wants back, and then almost like an unbidden thought, this other dream, both of which reference her personal history, is she ups the speed on the treadmill, remembering she has to be 3 times as good. And it again ties into this ideology of personal achievement. And there's the one side of it, which is, of course, as a Black woman, she knows she has to be better just because she's held to a different standard. But it is also throughout the poem returned to that she is putting a lot of value on her own personal ability to achieve or transcend what is being thrown at her. And it turns then into her revisiting that dream in the Rockies. And this is extra textual, but she, as she went on to hold positions at universities where she worked against affirmative action programs, and just generally has been very committed to a pretty standard, she runs faster back to the right, finally hitting her stride. Mozart returns to her side, this vision of whiteness coming to her, and that her stride is back and to the right is I think it's not a stretch to say conservative policy to the right, but that what she's worked for, she was actually a Democrat until the early 80s. Fun fact.
Wow.
Ronald Reagan, also a Democrat in his early days, helped promote the New Deal, but hey, we all know how that ended. Anyway, yeah, Elizabeth Warren, Republican in her early years. So, we all learn, grow, and change over our lives, hopefully. But the point being that she has, throughout her life, been very committed to this idea of personal advancement and work, rise through merit kind of ideas that are pretty standard right-wing ideology, but that's something that is a big part of who she is as a person and what she's talked about and worked for in her life. And so it's something that this poem, again, that's a subtext that's very clear in the feature article, and it doesn't, I think, detract from the fact that she as a person is accomplished, talented, intelligent. But this poem, I think, injects that necessary questioning and that necessary idea of not just what does that all mean, but it also reflects that she herself might be more conflicted than a lot of her political opponents would want to talk about her being. They might want to create this evil idea of who she is, and actually there's probably a lot going on there, which I think is, both of those things I think are really valuable elements that this poem takes on.
Yeah. Oh, that's so right. That 3 times is good. There's such a, I don't know if it's attributed to anyone in particular, but there's a very common saying, I just in the Black community or whatever, but you have to be twice as good to get half as far,
Yes.
Which separately appears on the TV show Scandal, which was a great show for a couple of seasons, and then it got crazy.
Oh my God, it went so sideways so fast. Whoa.
Great show, loved a lot of it, but that was a big thing. And I think the 3 times as good. It's like not just Black, but also a Black woman as like intersectionally different and having to overcome even more barriers to get as far as she did.
The famous, similar to the quote you mentioned, but as relates to being a woman, is that Fred Astaire was the greatest dancer, but Ginger Rogers did everything he did backwards and in heels. And the idea of doing everything backwards and in heels as a woman, you have to, you're, again, it's very similar, but as you were saying, it's this intersectional point where Condoleezza Rice is a Black woman.
And the treadmill scene is it's like very cinematic, it feels, where I just have seen that scene where the character is running and they have their dream or whatever, or their flashback or whatever is haunting them, and they're just like trying to run it out, which in part is just a very effective coping strategy. We know that running and exercise releases endorphins and exhausts the body. I'm curious what you think about this generally, but for a poet it's not like a persona poem exactly, in that Condoleezza Rice is spoken about in the third person. But, the speaker is clearly nowhere near the situation, right? And Nikky Finney, for all we know, does not know Condoleezza Rice personally or whatever. We often think about, or I often talk about, or we often talk about poems as, trying to convey the experience of something or what it's like to do something or whatever. And in some ways, this is in part what it's like to be Condoleezza Rice in some kind of way, or an imagining of like, oh, it's not all like you don't really believe all this, or this game that you're playing, or at least there's something else, as you were saying, that's more conflicting about, like, you have this history, and that you don't just forget that. But I'm just curious, like, the move for a poet to take such a big political figure and write, 7 pages of poetry, focusing on them. Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that choice, because I don't think it's often that we see those kinds of people populating poems,
I think that is a really good question. And these poems came out in the book Head Off and Split, which came out in 2010. So it's the Bush administration is like sort of in the wake of them being over. And I don't know exactly when these poems were written, but they were published at a time when it would be like a little bit reflecting back on, well, what did that actually mean? And that was something that was kind of going on for a lot of commentators on the left, and especially for a lot of African-American left-wing thinkers and commentators about figures like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. What did it mean that these were people who were now in a conservative Republican administration? Because that kind of goes against a lot of, the conventional wisdom, let's say, about who votes for Democrats and who looks like Democrats versus Republicans. Republicans are stereotypically whiter and conservative and older and all that kind of stuff. Demographic stuff that has only sort of seemed to gather more truth over time. But what I was thinking, at least, and I don't want to obviously speak for Nikky Finney, and I don't know that if she has spoken on this. I sort of looked around and didn't see any definitive commentary on it, but she and Condoleezza Rice are both African-American women from the South of very similar ages. Nikky Finney's 3 years younger than Condoleezza Rice. And so on some level, it felt to me like this is Nikky Finney looking at someone with a similar history who took a very different path, just a completely different, journey through life, basically. And it's her really thinking through the complexities of what it means for somebody to be Condoleezza Rice and to embody all of these different, seemingly contradictory things to so many different people, including to herself. And it's something that, like, to some degree has become kind of popular to do. The two most high profile popular culture things I can think of that are kind of like this are uh, the films The Big Short and Vice. The Big Short about the financial crisis and Vice about Dick Cheney. Obviously, that's the most relevant because it takes a figure from the Bush administration and it tells his personal backstory from his, sort of wayward youth. The point being that, like, there are these kind of, there's become almost a genre, at least in films, of these almost drunk history like recreations of like these, fun versions of history that cast a little bit of a satirical light and a little bit are like fun retellings that help explain to you what the hell happened in the financial crisis, because who knows what a subprime mortgage is or how the whole securities market operates. So it's this combination of explaining the past, but also in the case of Vice, it's like bringing this character out who's often treated as a one-dimensional boogeyman, and then he becomes a three-dimensional boogeyman in the film. So that's fun. I think this poem and the Condoleezza Suite as a whole are doing more interesting, more complicated, more like thoughtful work, but it feels to me a little bit like a similar kind of investigation of the recent past going on, and this like injection of subjectivity into the history that can oftentimes get lost over time. And I really responded to the way that was working here.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Those are both Adam McKay films that I was referencing.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because in the same way that like movies, popular movies or mainstream kind of pieces of culture can like be read as sort of sites of like ideological content or whatever, which I know is something that you have thought a lot about. But it's ostensibly a piece of entertainment, a blockbuster movie, but when you like think about 24 or whatever the show, it's like, well, what is it saying about torture? In a more general way, you can think about just like various genre tropes of, like in a horror movie, like the black character always dying first or something. It's like, well, what does that say about the ways in which we think of black bodies as disposable or something? And in a similar way, Condoleezza Rice is a person, yes, but also she is a figure, and she is kind of like anyone on the public stage is, at least can be read as, especially since she's an agent or an actor of a nation or an administration or whatever. She can be a read as a site of some kind of content, I guess. For Nikky Finney, or at least for the poem, one thing, not to get into Finney's head, because obviously we can't do that, but the poem draws out kind of like the tension between the content and the ideologies and actions that her administration and she sort of took out or was part of, whatever, and puts that up against her, both her personal history, right, but also her like historical identity, as a black woman, or at least the history that comes along with that. And like it's what we've been talking about, but the kind of the tension between those two things, but not just as an interest maybe in Condoleezza Rice specifically, but like, and even I think about this, I mean, people I think have talked about this with Barack Obama, but in some ways he was when he was elected, it was like often talked about like the pinnacle, it's the first black president. It's like we've overcome some kind of racial inequality or discrimination. We have this attachment to symbolic achievements in some kind of way, and we have this attachment to representation, and representation matters. There's often a tension sort of between like the symbol and the material reality of like what's actually happening, I guess. I mean, in some ways, it's another sort of case where to use the linguistic blah, blah, blah structural stuff of like the sign, you have the signifier and the signified. Well, it's like Condoleezza Rice is a signifier of racial progress or something. And, breaking the glass ceiling or whatever. And yet the signified is, in fact, quite the opposite. But to some degree, Condoleezza Rice maybe is also embodying that ideology in some kind of way of a respectable, this is like the achievement of respectability politics, is you get Condoleezza Rice, a gifted classical pianist who's in the White House. Yeah. And then in a much broader sense, perhaps, just to really try to generalize a lot, is just, I think about, there's another part in the suite where also in Concerto 11, and the Chickering, by the way, is I think her piano, or the kind of her piano. At the end of it, it sort of says, no one inside her inner circle will suggest how else the dawning new day might sound if she would only, just this once, take her eyes off the score. Which I think is very interesting. And again, is sort of showing how Nikky Finney has this sort of extended metaphor quite brilliantly, how she's using sort of the language and the details of classical music and music to make this metaphor in sort of like new complex ways. But that there's a kind of script or a score that Condoleezza Rice is following. And I guess in a broad sense, even if you're, someone who's not like a conservative, if you're like a Black person who's trying to play the game, or, feels like that's the only way to survive or something, is to not get angry or be respectable or blah, blah, present yourself in certain ways in this kind of way, or work twice as hard or whatever, produces perhaps a similar kind of tension that the poem about Condoleezza Rice is sort of drawing out in a more extreme way, where you have on the one hand the 15-year-old successful pianist, and the other hand the horrifying trauma of the Birmingham bombing.
No, I think it's an excellent point. And I was lucky enough to meet and get to know a federal judge, African-American guy, who is a civil rights leader. And Damon J. Keith, he recently passed away in his mid-90s. But he would tell stories about what it was like to be a Black federal judge, to have reached this huge, he was on the appellate court. It's the one level below the Supreme Court. It's this incredibly high level of achievement. And one of the stories he would tell, which I don't think I've told on the podcast before, but he had just been named the chairman of the Bicentennial Committee. And so there were going to be plaques with his name on them put on every courthouse in the country that had the Bill of Rights on them. And it was going to have his name at the bottom. Every federal courthouse in the nation, you can go and see these plaques. They are there. It was for the bicentennial of the Constitution. And he came out from his hotel at the meeting that he had just presided over of every federal judge in the country, where they had voted to have him do this. He gave a speech and everything. He came out, and this guy walked up to him and said, "Boy, park my car," because he was a Black guy in a suit outside of a hotel. And so this guy just assumed that he was a bellman. And this was a story that Judge Keith would use to illustrate the fact that it didn't matter that he'd gone to law school. It didn't matter that President Johnson made him a district court judge, or that President Carter made him an appellate court judge, or that some people think if George Bush Sr. hadn't become president in the late 80s, that he might have had his name put forward as a possible Supreme Court judge. None of that mattered in that moment. In that moment, what mattered is a white man saw a black man well-dressed outside of a hotel, and his brain said, you're probably a bellman. And he also had stories about how he and his law clerk, who'd gone to Harvard, would go to a restaurant and get seated at the worst tables. It didn't matter that they were in suits and that he was an appellate court judge and that he was with a Harvard graduate who was his law clerk, who was going to go on to have a stellar legal career. None of that mattered, because in that moment, what mattered is that they were black. And so those were stories that he himself would use to sort of illustrate why respectability politics and this notion of achievement fails in a lot of instances, because it does not go after the structural underpinnings. And I feel like some of what Nikky Finney does with the Condoleezza Suite, and with this poem in particular, is works against a potential version of narrativization of Condoleezza Rice's life story. Because I think you can almost imagine the eventual biopic where, by the luck of by sheer luck, she escapes violence in the South and works incredibly hard to become a concert pianist, and goes on to rise through the ranks and gets noticed as a bright young political operative, and then becomes national security advisor and becomes Secretary of State and writes best-selling books. And there's always wild speculation about will she or won't she run for president, and she never decides to, because she serves in other ways. And all of that is factually true about her life, and as we were saying, she's on paper and in reality an incredibly impressive person, but that doesn't really get to the actual truth of what's going on. It tells one clean, conventional story that leaves out the important complexities that Nikky Finney is constantly pointing back to and drawing out. And I think that these poems feel to me almost like a preemptive intervention against that kind of storytelling about, as you were saying, a complicated figure, public figure like Condoleezza Rice, onto whom so much is written and assumed and discussed, and how much she's held up as a symbol. This puts all those symbols and signs in conversation with each other, as opposed to saying, think this about her, think that about her. This is saying, these are all of the things that people think about and say about and use the person of Condoleezza Rice for. What does it mean that that's what we do with somebody like her?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you have any other thoughts?
I don't think so. Shall we read it again?
I think we got to read it again.
All right. The Condoleezza Suite Excerpt, Concerto No. 7, Condoleezza Working Out at the Watergate by Nikky Finney. Condoleezza rises at 4, stepping on the treadmill. Her long fingers brace the 2 slim handles of accommodating steel. She steadies her sleepy legs for the long day ahead, and she doesn't get far. Her knees buckle, wanting back last night's dream. Dream number 9. She is 15 and leaning forward from the bench, playing Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, alone, before the gawking, disbelieving, applauding crowd. Not dream number 2. She is 9, and not in the church that explodes into dust, the heart pine floor giving way beneath her friend Denise, rocketing her up into the air like a jack-in-the-box of a black girl wrapped in a Dixie cross. She ups the speed on the treadmill, remembering she has to be 3 times as good. Don't mix up your dreams, Condi. She runs faster, back to the right, finally hitting her stride. Mozart returns to her side. She is 15 again, all smiles, and relocated to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, where she and the Steinway are the only black people in the room.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena. Woo woo! Woo.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.